This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello, this is Simon from Film Stories. I'm delighted to tell you that this podcast is brought to you in association with Prop Store. Our friends at Prop Store are putting on a new entertainment memorabilia live auction, which is kicking off on March the 25th, 2026. You can view the catalogue and start bidding now. Some choice lots that I've found. Right, don't bid against me for any of these. So, 1989's Batman, there is a full size of the Gotham City Cathedral Bell is going up for auction. Staying on the Batman theme, meanwhile, I mean, the mightiest of all Batman films is clearly 1997's Batman and Robin. Right, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze, his light-up freeze gun is also going up for auction. And then if you want something particularly niche, any fans out there of 1995's Crimson Tide from the late, great Tony Scott? Yep. You can have the launch key with a pair of nuclear launch codes. That prop from the film is included in the auction. It's a 4-day auction. You can bid on it online. You just need to get yourself to www.propstoreauction.com and sign up there, and there's lots across film, TV and animation just waiting for you. The golden rule of all of this, the biggest rule of all, when you're at propstoreauction.com, don't bid against me.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I am welcoming back a returning guest, and that is Lindsay Nelson. Lindsay, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Today we are going to be talking about Creepy, which is in Japanese, it's creepy, but also with the subtitle偽りの隣人, which basically means like fake neighbor. But before we dive too much into that, it's been a little bit since we've had you on the show, so why don't you remind people about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Lindsay Nelson. I am an associate professor at Meiji University in Tokyo, and my research focuses on contemporary Japanese cinema, in particular Japanese horror films. And I have a book called Circulating Fear, Japanese Horror, Fractured Realities, and New Media. And recently, I've also been doing some research on Japanese horror YouTube. So I have an article coming out in a few months about the YouTube channel Fake Documentary Q, which is a very cool sort of found footage Japanese horror channel that you can find on YouTube.
Yeah, my wife and I fairly recently watched A Strange House, which I believe started off as one of those YouTube ones. Yeah,
it definitely did. Yeah, that's another really fun YouTube phenomenon where it started off. There's a channel called Uketsu, which made this video called Strange House that got many millions of views and was very popular. And then it became a feature film. And there is also that writer has put out a couple of books, one called Strange Pictures, another one called Strange Houses, which have been translated into English and which have been bestsellers. They've been really successful.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, my wife loved the YouTube stuff, but she was a little bit disappointed in the movie, and I think it's because, not to spoil too much, but we had just fairly recently we had watched the TV show Ganabo, and there are some very similar things in both of those. So she was like, "It reminds me of Ganabo," and I like Ganabo better.
Honestly, I didn't really care for the movie, and I think it's a classic situation of some things just work better in short form. And I think the Strange House video and the Strange House short stories are really well done. But then when you pad it out to a feature-length film, sometimes it doesn't work.
So, what kind of stuff have you been doing in your classes, or anything interesting that's come up in your research lately?
Let's see. So I teach some cinema-focused classes here at Meiji, and I actually don't really teach horror very often just because my students are afraid of it. So if I have like a horror-focused class, not many people will come. But I do have one class that I teach every year called Haunted Japan, which is about, folk tales and ghosts and spooky things. And we actually I used Creepy, the film, in that class, so that I'll talk a little bit about the students' reactions to that later. But in terms of recent things I've learned about recently, there's a couple of movies out that I still haven't been able to see that I really want to see that are getting a lot of attention. There's a new Japanese horror film called Mag Mag. Which is directed by a Japanese woman comedian named Yurian Retriever, which is a kind of funny name. And she's a comedian, and she doesn't. I don't think she appears as an actor in this movie, but she just directed this horror film, which is getting a lot of positive buzz. And then also Koji Shiraishi, very well-known filmmaker who made Noroi, The Curse, and a bunch of other kind of found footage style horror films. He has a new film out called About a Certain Place in the Kinki Region, which I think is about to be released with English subtitles, and that's also been getting a lot of positive buzz. So looking forward to seeing both of those.
And for any listeners who don't know, I assume by kinky you're referring to the actual region's name.
Yes, I am. So definitely, if you have high school students or university students or even adults who are studying Japanese and they learn that there is a region in Japan which is Kinki, Kinki. And when people say it's like, oh yeah, I'm from Kinki, it can be a little confusing at first.
Yeah, my favorite was first telling people about Fukuoka. It's like, fuck you, okay.
Yeah. That too. Yeah. Yeah, there's a few names that when pronounced in English sound a little odd, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you'd mentioned the horror film aspect. That's something that I always find interesting about Japanese students, because Japanese horror is like renowned across the world as like some of the most inventive, some of the greatest horror films ever. But you talk to so many Japanese people and they're like, "Oh my God, I hate horror movies."
I mean, to be fair, I think that's the norm around the world. Like, certainly horror movies have their fans, but I would say that like just when I meet people in my daily life, the vast majority of them, the first thing they say to me is, I just can't. I don't watch horror films. They're just too scary. So it is certainly true that I think people all over the world, there are a lot of people who don't like horror films. In the case of my particular group of students and other students that I've taught in Japan, I do occasionally have students who will tell me, they're fans of horror movies and they like them. But I find that a lot of students here at Meiji, at least over the last few years, first of all, a lot of them don't really watch movies. The young kids, I think these days are more into the short form content. They're watching TikTok and YouTube and things like that, and maybe like TV series, but they're not watching as many movies. And they also just a lot of them don't really want to watch anything that's even mildly upsetting. They don't want to watch things that will stress them out in any way. So they don't want to watch things that have a sad ending or things that are, stressful. They tend to gravitate more toward kind of fluff content. So yeah, so it's kind of frustrating. I'm always really happy when I do have in my class at least one or two students who are into horror movies so that we can kind of bond over that.
It's funny. And it's like a fundamental English class, and it's for just, regular students. And for years I've been teaching this class and they're just zero interest. And I've been just going off the textbook type stuff, and they hated it. I hated it. So I decided this year I was going to start using movies as a way to introduce the different grammar points. So we go through a grammar point, we show them like, we split a movie into 4 parts. So we show like 30 minutes per class, go over the grammar point for like 45 minutes, show half of the movie or a quarter of the movie, and then look at the grammar point in the movie. And then at the end of those 4 classes, they do a short presentation talking about their opinion of it. And it's been working really good. And I give the students a list of English movies to choose from and rank what they're interested in. I give them the descriptions in Japanese and everything. And yeah, so and the start of each class, it's a full year class. So it's like the first semester and the second semester. And the first semester, I just asked them to, do a self-introduction in the first class and everything. And in the second semester, I asked them to do a talk about a little bit about their summer. Like, well, what movies did you see over the summer? Anything like that. And no joke, I think there are out of all the students, there are about like maybe 60 students across 3 classes. I think maybe 5 actually said, oh yeah, I saw a movie this summer. The rest are like, I didn't watch any movies over the summer. I'm like,
Yeah.
but also the upsetting thing is funny too, because it was funny because one of the movies they chose was Jaws. And so I'm like, okay.
Huh.
And there were a lot of students, and the students were like very split in their opinions. Like half of them said that they loved it, half of them said they didn't like it. but it was for the same reasons. Like the half who loved it, they're like, "Oh, this movie was so thrilling. It was so scary. I loved it." And the other half, like, "This movie was too scary. It was too
Yeah.
thrilling. I didn't like
Yeah.
it." But even with that too, like we talked about, the first movie we watched last semester was Back to the Future, and in a few students, like they all liked it most for the most part, but a few students did say, "I didn't like how violent it was." I'm like, Back to the Future?
Yeah. Yeah, and well, that's a really interesting example. I feel like Back to the Future is strangely popular in Japan. And I mean, obviously, it was a huge hit when it came out in the United States, but it's really popular with like people my age, people in their 40s in Japan who maybe also, I guess, watched it as kids or something. But it has a huge following here, and so I often encounter, teenage students who know it through their parents or something, and they talk about it. But yeah, I haven't seen that one in a few years, but I remember going back and watching it and thinking it is quite intense, actually. I think it's we when we remember it, we mostly remember the fun and the silliness, but it has some pretty dark moments as well. So yeah, I can see how it might have been a little upsetting for some students.
Yeah, it was funny, but on that thing too, I think a big part of it too is just like the merchandise, because they have like Back
Mm,
to the Future shirts and Jaws shirts like
yes,
in
yes.
Uniqlo
Hmm.
and H&M and things like that. And I really
Yeah,
think that is why they chose those two movies, because they see these shirts all the
interesting.
time and they're like, "Oh, I
Sure.
wonder what this movie," because none of them had ever like maybe like two or three had seen the movies before. Everyone
Okay.
else like, "Oh, this is
Mm,
my first time watching it."
mm.
Um so yeah, I think it is that merchandising aspect. I see the same thing with like so many of my students, they'll buy these clothes with these things on, and they'll have no concept of what it is.
Yeah.
I remember one time I saw a girl, she had like a Marvel shirt and like a Marvel
Hmm.
bag or something. And I said, "Oh, I love Marvel." I'm like, "Who's your favorite character?" And she's
Yeah,
like, "What are you
she
talking
doesn't know.
about?" I'm like, The Marvel movies, she's like, "Oh, I didn't know they were movies."
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just like she's like, "I just like the design." I'm like, "Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
fair enough." But anyway, as I mentioned before, we are talking today about Creepy. This is a 2016 movie, psychological thriller from Kiyoshi Kurosawa. We had you on here to talk about one of my favorite of his movies, which is Pulse. We've also talked about a few other of his films, like Cure as well, and starring Hidetoshi Nishijima, Yuko Takeuchi, Teruyuki Kagawa, Haruna Kawaguchi, and Masahiro Higashide. And it was based on a novel from 2012 by Yutaka Maekawa. And it's about this married couple. The husband is a police detective, and after an intense situation dealing with a psychopath, he ended up retiring from the police force, and now he's working as a university professor. And him and his wife, they move into this new house, and the neighbors like don't talk to anybody. And one of their neighbors, though, they end up having a conversation with him. They start talking to him, but there's something off about him. And at the same time, he also gets involved in this cold case and starts investigating this cold case about it, and it just kind of builds up from there. But so what is your history with this movie?
So I actually have a vivid memory. I saw this movie in a theater and it was a double feature for me. So I saw it on the same day that I saw Sadako versus Kayako, which is another Koji Shiraishi movie about, the two characters from The Ring and The Grudge who have a cage match at the end of the film. Um, and what I really vividly remember is, I had bought tickets and I think I saw Sadako versus Kayako in the morning, and then I saw Creepy in the afternoon. And Sadako versus Kayako isn't great, in my opinion. It's not terrible. It just didn't really hold me. And I watched this like, oh, okay, that's over. And then I remember going to see Creepy, and immediately within the first few minutes, I was like, I'm in good hands, because Kurosawa is just so good at what he does. I don't love all of his films. I think some work better than others, but he's just so skilled at crafting a shot and crafting a scene. So from the very opening moments of this film, where we're in an interrogation room in a police station, and then throughout the film, just the way that he sets up everything, the pace of the film, the performances. I was never bored. Every shot that appeared on the screen, I was just kind of mesmerized just by the visuals. And then I think the story too is really fascinating. And One thing that I always am grateful for, because it just doesn't happen as often as it used to. It's genuinely frightening. I found this film really frightening in a lot of ways, not so much in a jump scare way, but just in the way that it really gets under your skin. And in particular, the performance by Tadayuki Kagawa as Nishino, the creepy guy of the title, is so creepy and so effective. So yeah, this was I really enjoyed watching this one, and I've seen it several times since then, and I always enjoy rewatching it.
I first saw this maybe about like 2 or 3 years ago, I think. It was one of these movies that my wife saw at Tsutaya and she's like, "Oh, I want to watch this." I said, "Okay, sure." So we watched it. And and I got excited too once I saw it was Kiyoshi Kurosawa. And after we watched when we watched it, like the first half I loved. The first half I was like completely absorbed into it. And we get into the second half, like the first time I saw it after we finished watching it, and I went back and I checked, I recorded on Letterbox. I rated it, I think I remember liking it more than I did because
Mm.
uh when I checked my rating, it was 3.5 stars. I gave it on Letterbox, and then and when I went to Letterbox to log it again for this latest viewing, I was thinking before I even got to my old review, I'm like, I think I'm gonna make it a 3.5 this time, and it was the exact same rating. So I
Mhm. Yeah.
so I think my over time my opinion of it got higher and
Mm.
than I actually remembered it being.
Yeah.
Um, and when I watched it too, this and I remember liking it a lot more, but I can't remember exactly what I was thinking about it. But I think it was mostly that, and I think one of the you're talking about this about Kurosawa being such a skilled director. I think it's the atmosphere of it that really
Hmm. Yeah.
improved my opinion of it over time, and it
Yeah.
made me think that I had a higher opinion of it than I actually did. And and also, yeah, completely second Kagawa's performance, especially because when you realize he's the same guy from Tokyo Sonata,
Yes. Yeah.
and
That's
and
that's some
he
range.
yeah, because he plays, and there are some scenes when he gets very intense in that movie, but it's like a desperation kind of intensity. It's not like a
Mhm.
creepy kind of intensity. Whereas here he feels very, very sadistic and
Mm.
sociopathic. And I thought he did
Yeah.
a really good job of playing that. Um but also not only that, but also just becoming coming off, as the title says, very, very creepy. Like
Mhm.
just the way
Yeah.
he moves and the way he like approaches people and the way he like looks and talks, everything about his performance seems like deliberately planned to make like the maximum creep factor.
Yeah, and I think like there's something about this character. I think that, at this point we've all seen either in horror movies or other types of movies depictions of creepy people or depictions of psychopathic people. And at this point I feel like it's really hard to do anything new with that, if you, other than just having someone be immediately like frothing at the mouth and weird and goofy. But what's so effective for me about this performance is that he's not the type of creep you expect. Like, he doesn't do or say like immediately inappropriate or uncomfortable things. He doesn't make like sexual suggestions or anything like that. He just is odd and he just responds to questions in a way that does not make sense. He, switches tones very quickly to where you question your own perception. You're like, did that really happen? And so he's just incredibly good at making other characters immediately feel wrong-footed, and also making the audience question, did that really what just happened? Like, I think, and he can switch so quickly from like charming and normal to very weird that it's hard to keep up. Like, there's a scene where he and the detective's wife are just having a fairly normal conversation. And then she just says, "Oh yeah, I really want to meet your wife at some point." And he just goes cold and just says to her, "What do you mean by that?" And of course, she's just like, I don't mean anything." And and you, the audience too, are like, why is he saying that? And so I can just immediately put myself in that position and just be like, my God, that would be exhausting, to interact with this person who you have no idea how they're going to react to very, very, boring and just kind of, standard ways of greeting or having a conversation.
Yeah, that section stood out to me as well, especially because in the context of it, this is like I think that's the first scene where we meet Mio, who he
Yes,
introduces
the
as his
daughter. Yeah.
daughter.
Right.
And they're playing with the dog and everything, and she's like, oh, I really hope to see your wife next time. She's like, and it's
Mm.
just like on a dime, he just
Yeah.
completely switches, and it's just like,
Hmm.
yeah, each time that line like just kind of stood out to me, and just like the way
Yep.
he changes on that, and
Hmm.
um but also with and he does that too in the scene when he runs into Koichi, the husband, on the street, right? And the
Hmm.
weird thing,
Yeah.
there's this weird thing where almost every shot that when it opens up, like in a new establishing shot, it's like the character just kind of standing there very still, and then
Yes.
moves
Yeah.
into, and then it's like
Hmm.
almost as if Kurosawa was telling them, it's like, okay, just wait, 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 now go. And it
Yeah.
was just a really interesting dynamic because it feels like he's almost like turning on in a sense whenever he finds
Yeah.
the right person.
And I feel like I see that in a lot of Kurosawa films, where ostensibly, I would say most of Kurosawa's movies, they take place in the real world. They take place in a real version of Tokyo or wherever. And yet something is always just slightly off, whether it's the way people behave or the way things are filmed. And that type of shot is kind of typical of that, I think, where he will open a shot, instead of with like someone in process, walking toward the camera, they're still and then they start walking. And it's not a mistake. I think it's a conscious choice just to make things kind of weird. And there are several scenes in this movie where like someone runs away and then they just kind of stop like next to a wall and they just sort of like stare at the wall. And it's just odd behavior. And I think probably the best example of this way that he just sort of keeps things a little weird, and I might have talked about this with Pulse, is there is a shot that appears in almost all of his films. It's the vehicle floating in space shot, where you have a person or a group of people in a car or a bus, and they're driving, or they're passengers, but all of the background looks like clouds and it's kind of blurry. So it feels like this vehicle is floating just in the ether. And we get that in this film near the end, when Nishino has effectively, kidnapped and brainwashed everyone, and they're all kind of driving away. And we see Yasuko, the wife, is driving, and everyone else is a passenger, but it looks like the car is just floating in the sky. And it's so weird because there aren't any other moments really that suggest we're living in some kind of weird alternate universe. But as soon as that shot pops up, I'm like, yeah, okay, this things are weird. We're they're not totally normal.
Yeah, there's an isolating effect in a lot of Kurosawa's movies. Like there's the lots of like big shots where there's very few characters involved, so there is this kind of like isolating feel in a lot of his stuff. I mean, Pulse, obviously
Yeah.
that was a big part of the story too. But even
Hmm.
in like when I'm thinking back to Tokyo Sonata or even this movie, I'm really realizing that now there is a lot of that kind of like isolation feeling. And going
Definitely.
back to what I
Yeah.
was saying about Nishino's creepiness, like the way
Hmm.
he approaches Koichi at that one time,
Yeah.
and he starts talking to him, it's like very casually first, right? He's like, oh, I'm your neighbor, Nishino. He's like, oh, it's nice to meet you. And
Hmm.
he's like, yeah, I talked to your wife the other day. He's like,
Yeah.
by the way, she's kind of a nuisance.
Yeah.
What? It's like, and this is right after,
Yeah.
this is directly after that scene when she had asked him about his wife.
Yes.
Um,
Hmm.
and then later he apologizes and he says, well, she's been sick for a while. She's got depression.
Hmm.
And then so Yasuko decides, and the way he's playing around with them, like he's off-putting at first, then he kind of ingratiates himself with them, and he gets a little bit closer and closer, then he says something to be off-putting again. It's a very interesting way that he's batting them around from side to side, almost kind of like in the manosphere bullshit pickup artist thing, they talk about
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
negging
Negging.
thing.
He's negging them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and that's kind of what I got the feeling of too when I was watching
Hmm.
how he's acting in here.
Yeah. And it's particularly effective, I think, in the context of Japan and the certain rules of social mores that you have around like people who move to a new neighborhood and the phrases they're supposed to use. when you go to introduce yourself to the neighbors, and also just when you meet people for the first time. And you can feel in those scenes both Koichi, the detective, and his wife Yasuko, they're playing the game. They're giving the phrases, and Nishino is not playing the game. He's being weird and being rude, and you can tell that they kind of don't know how to deal with it. And this led to a really interesting exchange in the class where I used this film after the students had watched it. I asked them for their reactions, and this class is a mix of foreign exchange students, English speaking foreign exchange students, and Japanese students who speak English at a pretty high level. So the class is conducted in English. And so I just asked them what they thought of it. And one of the students from the US immediately raised their hand and just said, I thought that husband and wife were weird. They were so formal. They spoke in such a stilted way with each other. It didn't seem realistic to me at all. And then thankfully, one of the Japanese students immediately raised his hand and said, I didn't think they seemed formal at all. They sounded like my mom and dad. So that to me is it's really interesting if you look at this movie and its dialogue in particular, in the context of just the way that people talk to each other in an intimate setting versus the way that people talk to each other when they're meeting for the first time, and the way that how dramatic it is, how different Nishino is, because I mean he's weird and creepy in any context, but in particular in the context of people moving to a new neighborhood in Japan and the way you're supposed to behave. Nishino is deeply, deeply wrong and deeply weird.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well, having moved a few different times in my time here in Japan, and having to go through that ritual where you go up to the house, you buy
Hmm.
something. So for people who don't know what we're talking about, every time
Hmm.
you move into a new building or a
Yeah.
new house, you're supposed to go around to at least your closest neighbors, like the ones who
Yes.
live on like
Right.
either side of you.
Hmm.
If you live in a small building, then you might go to like every unit in the building if it's like, like maybe four units or something like that.
Yes. Right. Right.
Um,
Hmm.
and then you'll just kind of like go around and you'll get like something like, and they sell like packs of stuff like at the drugstore or
Yes.
something
Yeah.
where you can
There's
buy
there.
like
Yeah.
a
There are gifts for every occasion in Japan, and they're
exactly,
labeled.
yeah.
It's like this is your midwinter gift, your midsummer gift. This is your moving in gift. Like
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, so usually we'll get like the energy drink things, what my wife usually likes to pick
Mm-hmm.
out. So we go around and
Yeah.
we go and give them like a pack of energy drinks. Be like, oh,
Hmm.
this is something insig, and you do the
And
whole
yeah,
song
you
and dance
always
like
say
this
there's a
is this
very yeah.
boring, insignificant thing.
Yes.
I'm sorry to
Yes.
bother you with my
Exactly.
trashy
Yeah.
gift.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then and it's funny. I teach a class in international relations, and the textbook I use they have a section about that where there's like about differences between Japanese culture and like Western culture, and one of them was about like this terrible gift. I hope you like it. It's like, and then the foreigner's thinking he's like, well, why are you giving it to me then?
Yeah.
And and that stood out to me because Nishino does what that imaginary Westerner in the
Yes,
textbook does.
exactly.
He's like,
Yeah.
why are you giving me this thing? That's
Yeah. Hmm.
and it's funny because you see like Yasuko's like brain almost fries in that moment because she
Yeah.
doesn't know how to
Yeah.
react to the breaking of the social norms there.
Yes. Yes. And that too, I think that when we see Yasuko's reaction and we see the struggle that she's going through to just try to, make peace with some of her neighbors, because there's another neighbor who's also uncommonly rude to them when they go and try to introduce themselves to this other neighbor. And then, she tries to make friends with Nishino. She can't. And so at one point, she just goes home and like throws the present in the garbage, and you can tell she's really frustrated. I feel like this touches on another big theme in a lot of Kurosawa's movies, which is just sort of the frustration and boredom of modern middle class life in Japan, where in several of his movies, either the main character or a side character is just so fed up with having to abide by the rules and having to be polite and having to go through these motions, just this endless repetition, that they become desperate for anything to happen, anything just to be interesting in their lives. And I feel like in this movie, that manifests in the way that Yasuko is just very susceptible to Nishino. Like obviously he effectively like drugs and kidnaps her, but we also through a couple of cues in the editing and the performance, we get the sense that she was kind of primed to be the ideal victim, because she wanted something. She wanted something to happen, even if it was something terrifying and violent. And so I feel like that final scene in particular, where, they've basically escaped, and now she kind of is awake and realizes what's happened, and she just screams and screams. And I feel like that is just a primal scream of everyone who is just like bored and frustrated and angry at the place where their life is. And so they've gone to really desperate and unhinged measures to make something interesting happen.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of stuff that happens off camera, it looks like, because we see the one scene where she's upstairs and she's been on the phone, and then she hangs up the phone, and Koichi asks her, he's like, "Who are you talking to?" And she gets very
Yeah.
defensive about it.
Yes, right,
And
right.
and then later she says, she's like, "Oh, it was just a friend of mine from high school." And it's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah, I
Mhm.
don't think so.
I wonder. Yeah.
And it never comes right out and says that she was talking to Nishino, but that's kind of the what's implied
Yeah,
there.
maybe.
But then also the scene where uh you see you see them from a distance, and her and Nishino are talking,
Yeah.
and she seems like disturbed, and she starts to walk away from him,
Mhm.
and he comes up behind her, he's like, "Can I shake your hand?" Right? And it's just like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
going to what you were saying, like
Mhm.
it's it's not a sexual,
No.
it's not like an overtly sexual remark he's making, but it's just like the way he's delivering it makes it
Yeah.
seem sexually
Yeah.
inappropriate. And
Yeah.
also when he tells her too, he's like, "Who do you find more charming, me or your husband?"
Ugh,
And it's
yeah.
like the way he says that, and not being prideful that stuff. Like my thought is just like, well, obviously her husband.
Yeah, right.
Look at you, dude.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like this weird, like, that's, we get like these little hints of like how the brainwashing is working without coming right out and
Right.
seeing it. Whereas if you're watching it from a distance, you can kind you're and I liken this to a lot of, which I'll come back later to, but the idea of like cults, I think, is kind of plays into some stuff
Yes,
with this
sure.
movie, which also ties into the
Mhm.
frustrations with middle class lifestyle and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But one of the things that kind of frustrated me watching this movie, and I don't think it picked up on it so much the first time, but the second
Mhm.
time I definitely picked up on it more, is just thematically, I understand what Kurosawa was trying to do here, or at least I think I kind of do. I kind of got like I'm kind of formed a thesis in my head for what his goal is with this movie. But looking at it from like a pure plot and story perspective, I see like a lot of issues with it.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, it's just like, first off, just the coincidental nature of it,
Yeah.
where he just happens to move into this house
Oh
next
yeah.
to this
Yeah.
guy who also just happens to be involved in this cold case that
Yep. Yep. That he
Koichi
just
just so
happened to
happens
find
to
out
get,
about from a
yeah,
coworker. Yeah.
from a coworker, and just like curious, like randomly he says like, "What's that one?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, this is this weird case with this family. The mother, the father, and the brother they met missing, and the daughter doesn't know what happened to them. They kept changing her story." He's like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." And they go and they investigate, and you find out that it's all linked together, and it's Koichi and it's Nishino in both cases.
Mm.
And then you've got his former detective partner, or his former,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
um
Yeah. Police coworker.
colleague,
Yeah.
yeah, at the
Hmm.
police department. I wanted to say inferior because I was thinking Kohai, but which is the word, but
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we don't really have a good translation of that in English, I
His
guess.
junior
His
or
junior,
something.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, but that's also the case that he had happened to be working on, and he was also still curious about that case. So
Yep.
it's like
Yep.
the coincidental nature of all of this was
Oh yeah.
really getting to me last night.
Yeah, and I think that this is very typical of Kurosawa films, I find. And like a lot of times they just kind of go off the rails in the third act, sometimes in the middle of the second act. And I think the extent to which it bothers me is proportional to the extent that I'm kind of sold on the visuals and the mood. So if I'm just really enjoying the visuals and the mood, I kind of don't really care. Whereas if I'm less focused on that, then I do kind of care. His most recent movie, Cloud, it was quite celebrated. I think a lot of people really loved it. I personally didn't really care for it for that reason. I think I just thought it went off the rails a little too much. And I think in this movie too, you can see a lot of the novel origin, because quite a few of Kurosawa's films, and then some other Japanese horror films as well, are based on these very successful kind of pulpy novels. That in some cases are published by Kadokawa, this publishing company that also makes films. And they tend to be pretty ludicrous, they tend to be sensational. And yeah, tons of coincidences. The plot has tons of holes, but they're high emotion, very intense, and so they're very popular. And yeah, this plot is insane. There's, like you said, there's just way too many coincidences. And then the fact that Nishino supposedly is able to do all of this because he has some sort of magic serum. He has these kind of old-timey steampunky syringes, and he drugs people, but the drug is very convenient. It seems to make people sort of compliant to his bidding for as long as the plot needs them to be. And then at a random moment, they suddenly wake up and realize where they are and try to get away, or, try to escape or something. And it's all very silly, but I feel like it still worked for me, just because of the strength of the performances. I feel like the actors really sell it. And just because the vibe worked, I thought the vibe was just overall really frightening, and it was effective. And also, going back to that theme of, were you really brainwashed? Was it really the drugs? Or were you just so ground down and desperate for any sort of interestingness in your life that you went ahead with this? You went along with this and let this happen, which is just a very kind of skin crawling question to be left with at the end of the movie.
And I can't hold the magic drug thing too much against Kurosawa in this too, because Takashi Miike used that in Audition too. And
oh, sure, yeah.
And he admitted like when she administers this drug that paralyzes him, but still keeps his nerves awake, so he can still feel all the pain. And I remember reading watching the commentary or reading it, and Miike was just like, "Yeah, we just made that up. We just needed we needed some way to explain like how she could torture him without this guy who's like twice her size reacting in any way." Mm-hmm. Yeah. But we're going to take a quick break. Maybe you'll hear some ads, and then we'll come back and we'll continue talking about this.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
LinkedIn's AI-powered job search can help you find the most relevant roles based on your goals and experience. It cannot help you find something to talk about in the elevator.
So, ride any dragons this weekend?
It can help you find your next job just by describing it in your own words. It cannot stop your coworker from describing their dreams.
So I was flying, right?
And while we can't help you advance in the office foosball tournament, LinkedIn can help you advance in your career. LinkedIn is the network that works for you.
And we are back, still talking about Creepy, directed by Kurosawa. And with the so I said that the kind of plot stuff was kind of driving me a little bit nuts in this movie. And as I was thinking about it, I was going back and forth in my head last night about it. And I think what I kind of landed on is this idea that, like you were hinting at, this kind of like frustration with this middle class lifestyle, and the fact that, because it seems like she's a housewife, right? So she doesn't have a job as far as we can see or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I just know from my own personal experience, like when my wife was home, with the kids before they were old enough for preschool, by the end of that 3-year stint, she was like going stir crazy being in the house all the time.
Yeah.
and that was in a case where, she still had friends around and stuff like that, right? She still had, she talked to her sister. She every now and then she'd be like, "Can you watch the kids? I'm gonna go out to lunch with a friend, or go out to go out with drinks for a friend." And so she still had, social interaction type stuff, but even still, she was starting to go a little bit crazy, being inside all the time. And in this case, they've just moved into this neighborhood. Yasuko is at home all the time, and it seems like there's only 3 houses in this section of the neighborhood where they're in. And one of them has this older lady. She's probably like in her 50s or 60s, maybe, with a bedridden mother. And she's just like an absolutely unsocial weirdo herself, right? When they come to give her the welcome gift, she's just like, we don't interact with any of the neighbors here.
Yeah. We don't talk to people.
And then she sees another one is Nishino. And, at first he seems really creepy and everything. She's off put by him. And I think that's a big part of her frustration when she comes in and she throws the remainder of the chocolates in the garbage, because it's just like she's so frustrated that the only options for social interaction she has is this older woman who can't be bothered and this weird creepy guy who's living next door to her, and her husband who's at work all the time anyway.
Yeah.
So I felt like that was also a part of it. And then when Nishino apologizes and he starts to ingratiate him, starts coming off, it's like, okay, maybe this guy just lacks some social cues.
Yeah,
maybe
right.
he's actually a nice guy, which I've known plenty of people like that before too, who it's just like
Sure.
they're nice. It's just like they just don't have very good social skills, and they mean well though. And
Sure.
he kind of comes off like this, and then she finds out, oh, he's got a daughter and he's got a wife, so maybe she starts thinking, oh, well, maybe this is someone I can ingratiate myself a little bit with. And then it just keeps kind of snowballing with that. Well, at the same time, you have Koichi, who is telling her stuff like, stop being such a good neighbor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Like, stop trying to talk with other people and all this kind of stuff. Just
Yeah.
and you get the sense that he also doesn't quite understand like the kind of social isolation she is dealing with, and which also helps make her more susceptible to what Nishino is laying down. And this is where I get to this idea that I had when I was trying to draw comparisons between what Nishino is doing to Yasuko and what he also did to this other family, and the Hondas, and what we see with cults, because the discussions around Saki's family, the Hondas, was really interesting, because she was saying how, because from Saki's perspective, from what we understand of her life. So for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, Saki in this movie, she's this now she's an adult woman, but she was a junior high school student when her parents and her brother disappeared one day, and no idea what happened to them or anything like that. But she says she remembered there's this other guy, Mizuta, who was always kind of like around, and he was like kind of all odd, and they're talking to him a lot, and so she had suspected there might have been something with him. And she had said, like, and one time she had heard them talking about something, like her parents and her brother saying something like, well, we'll wait until she's out of town before we go out. So you get the sense that Saki was someone who was, she had a pretty decent social life in her school life, probably, like she was part of the club activities and stuff like that. Maybe her brother wasn't, and her parents were probably also socially isolated. And so this is the kind of thing, the way that she was describing their attitude was very similar to what you hear people talk about when they get involved in cults and that kind of thing. So that kind of stood out to me a lot, because cults are a big issue in Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's we get to see quite a few characters who just, they're not fitting in, they're struggling to adjust. We hear from Saki that perhaps some members of her family were in debt. And we know that in Japan, if you get into debt, there are, just like anywhere, I guess, there are all kinds of shady characters who will come for you or who you might seek out to try to help you. And it's also a big source of shame. So it's something that you'll hide. I think we also find out that this Mizuta person was maybe in debt, and that maybe this is one gateway to how Nishino gets these people, is that, he preys on people who are kind of desperate. And also just, the number of people like Yasuko in this movie who are just, kind of trying to figure things out. And she admits, like, I'm just really having trouble adjusting. I don't have any friends around here. I'm kind of alone. And then toward the end of the film, she says, I gave up on a lot of things a long time ago, which is such a sad thing to say, and it really, in Pulse as well, I just can't help thinking that Kurosawa very frequently depicts characters who basically say some version of, what, it's just better not to have relationships. It's just better not to have friends. It's then people feel a sense of obligation, and, they demand more. And, maybe it's just better to keep your distance. There are characters who say that in Pulse. There are characters who say it here. Like the older neighbor lady is just kind of like, it's better if you don't get to know your neighbors, because then they'll just ask for things. And so I can't help wondering sometimes, like, is this how Kurosawa feels? You know, is he just the type of guy who maybe prefers to keep everybody at a distance, or is he just really interested in this question? And therefore he has a lot of characters talk this way, because I feel like the characters in this film and the characters in a lot of his films, they clearly want people. They clearly want to connect. They're clearly lonely and they're desperate for some type of connection, and yet they are also deeply frustrated by the sense of obligation and the sense of niceties and proprieties that they all have to, fulfill in this society. So, that push-pull, I think, is at the center of a lot of his movies.
No, yeah, and I think it's an interesting idea because they're not wrong. There is kind of this sense of obligation that comes with friendships in Japan, right? Like famously, for anyone who doesn't know, if you get invited to somebody's wedding, depending on your relationship with that person determines like how much money you're expected to give them as a gift.
Yeah.
And then when they invite you back, and then if you invite them to your wedding later, then they have to match the gift.
Yep.
Or like, someone gives you a gift for something. And, I went through this with my wife when we were in the States recently. She was going out of her mind with omiyage and stuff. So much so that we actually had to get another suitcase because of all this stuff. And I'm just like, and I'm trying to like reason with her. I'm like, and she was getting angry with me actually. Because I was saying like, do we need the boxes and all this stuff? Like, can't we just take it out of the box? And she's like, no, you need the box.
You
like,
can't.
Why do you
need the box?
And then she starts like getting angry and ranting at me in Japanese. I'm like, okay, I'm just asking.
Yep.
And it's that is that obligation type of thing where you're expected to, if you go on a trip, you're expected to get gifts for everybody and, your coworkers and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just like, and me, like, fortunately since I'm an adjunct teacher, so I don't interact directly with a whole lot of people. I don't have that same kind of obligation. Plus I'm a foreigner too. So it's like, there's one school where I have like, fairly regular interaction. And those people, I just bought like a box of a bag of candy and then it's like, here, and that was fine.
Yeah.
But she had to like go out of her way to make sure like to get individual gifts for like all the coworkers that she sits around and stuff like that, like specific mugs and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just like, and it was driving me nuts. I'm like, we have to get back on the plane, right? We have to transport this shit. Then when we get to Tokyo, we have to transport it from Tokyo. And so it was driving me nuts. And I get that idea of just like, maybe, and I was thinking like, maybe that old woman does have a point. Maybe it is better not to be involved in these obligations.
Yeah. And it's funny because like, I think, it's normal, say for foreign nationals who live in Japan to complain about this stuff and to say, well, this is just silly. Why do you do this? But the thing is, most of my Japanese friends and colleagues complain about it too. They don't really like it, and yet they feel powerless to change it. And I will say, I do feel like the younger generation is not as beholden to a lot of this stuff. And I know that in my workplace, people bring omiyage, but there isn't this sense that you have to get an individualized gift for everyone. And I recently went to a wake for a colleague as well. And, that is an incredibly formal, ritualized event where you have to, give money in a very particular type of envelope, and you have to bow a certain number of times in a certain number of directions. And after the fact, I was talking to several of my Japanese colleagues who freely admitted that they had no idea what to do, and that they had to like go on the internet and look it up and stuff. And so I feel like there's this strange situation where a lot of people in Japan who grew up in Japan, who are Japanese, who are immersed in a lot of these sort of, very detailed and kind of high pressure situations where you have to behave a certain way and you have to say a certain number of things. They also don't like it. They find it very frustrating, and yet they don't feel like it's possible to opt out. And so then you have people who opt out in the most extreme way possible. You have people like hikikomori, who just decide to isolate themselves in their rooms for years at a time so that they don't have to interact with other humans. Or you have people like the characters in these Kurosawa films who basically just say, you know what? Maybe it's just better to be a hermit. Maybe it's just better to not, interact with people too much, because then you got to buy them presents and then you got to follow all these rules that are very tiring.
well, it's fine. I think last time you were on it, we were talking about the Koreeda film, and I think I said in that episode that one of the things I noticed about Koreeda as I'm going through his filmography is it feels like he's getting angrier and angrier with every movie he makes because he's saying the same shit and nobody's listening.
Yep.
And I feel
Yep.
like, maybe the same thing's happened with Kurosawa a little bit as well.
Yeah. Maybe both of these guys are getting older, and as you get older, you get a little more curmudgeonly. I think they've both been somewhat curmudgeonly already, but yeah, I think they're maybe they're getting more and more frustrated with certain aspects.
They're approaching
of
their
modern
Miyazaki
life.
phase.
Yeah, definitely.
So what about another thing that I thought was interesting was just like Koichi's approach to police work too. And this is kind of like and I think this is something that had some really interesting legs to it, but it doesn't seem to be a question that Kurosawa was overly concerned with. I think he was more interested in like the social dynamics here. But one of the things that stood out to me at the beginning of the movie, when he's still this this detective, is he's talking about this guy who's like a sociopath. He's very interested in finding out more about him, and the other cop's like, no, we just got to get this guy out of here. He's the public prosecutor's stuff now. It's like we've done our job. We're done now. Don't worry about it. And you get the sense that one of the reasons why Koichi quit the police force was not only the fact that he was injured, right, which happened in the opening scene, but also just the fact that he is kind of frustrated dealing with the police who are just kind of like, we don't want to understand these guys. We're just here to, we're just cogs in the machine type of thing. And that also comes into play when his colleague Nogami comes back to him later, and he says to him, he's like, you're the only one who knew about like police psychology, criminal psychology. It's feels like something important that you should have in a police detective.
Yeah. And I think there's two interesting things about that. One thing is this time when I rewatched the film just the other day, I was really thinking about the title. Because of course, I think on the surface, the title refers to Nishino, this creepy neighbor. But the more I watch this film, the more I start to think that Koichi is also kind of a creep. That he does some things that are also extremely creepy. The way that he handles police work, and the way that after he is retired from the force, it just is he actually says it's like, oh, it's just a hobby now. But he takes a kind of like creepy interest in this cold case where, he's interrogating this poor young woman who lost 3 members of her family. And when she tells him more details, he says things like, oh, sugoi omoshiroi desu ne, like this, oh, this is so fascinating. And you can see in her expression, she's like, what? And he's like, oh, sorry, no, this is just interesting to me. So he's kind of eating it up in a way. And also just the way that he treats her is pretty horrifying. Like he's just very aggressive. There's a scene where he like confronts her at her home and he's grabbing her and like pushing her against the wall. And the way he treats his own wife, I think at times is also really upsetting. Like, I mean, first of all, it's obvious that he's just been neglecting her because he has completely missed that she's obviously, struggling with mental health wise, and that he just, is very aggressive with her as well when he can't understand what's going on. So I feel like the title is maybe indicating that, sometimes the creep is not who you think it is, or sometimes the other person can be creepy as well. And also just the idea of how he handles his police work. I feel like the beginning of this movie is such an old story. It's the savvy police detective who has a very bad experience, finally retires from the force, but there's one more case and he gets pulled back in. And so the movie sets itself up. We think we know where it's going. We think that this is going to be the story of the guy who gets pulled back, but it's not really. It goes in very different directions. So I kind of like that about it. I like that it takes this very familiar trope and just kind of goes zigzagging off in a whole bunch of other places.
Yeah, it does some and I think you make a good point there. I hadn't considered that, but there was one line that really kind of stood out to me from Koichi when he's teaching. Which, first off, his teaching style is very curious to me because this movie was, and I had to double check the date on this movie because it was made in 2016. And like, I don't know about you when you teach, but like me, I use like PowerPoint slides. I'm moving around the classroom. I'm standing, I'm gesturing and stuff like that. But he's sitting at a desk with a page of notes and he's just reading off his notes.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very weird. One of the lines that particularly jumped out at me is he's talking about this one case where, and it's an American case, and he says that the killer had taken these four prostitutes to the hotel room, and he raped them and then murdered them, and then he said, and then he ends with this line, he's like, and everything's bigger in America, I guess. I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay.
Like,
I'm like,
wow.
I understand gallows humor among police detectives
Still,
and all that
yeah.
kind of stuff,
Ugh.
but you know,
Mhm.
you're pushing it a little bit here, buddy.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't, this is a bit of a tangent, but there are two associations with the cast of this film that I think are kind of dark and tragic. First of all, Teruyuki Kagawa. If we Google Teruyuki Kagawa assault charges, you'll find some interesting stories that maybe suggest that this character was not
Oh,
so far
yes.
off
I did
from
remember
who
hearing
he
about that
is,
now. Yeah.
allegedly, although he has confessed to a lot of it. And second, Yuko Takeuchi, who plays Yasuko, tragically passed away very young, and I believe by suicide, although there was no official cause of death listed. I think there were hints that that's what happened. She may have had postpartum depression. And she was this, just very, very successful actress who had appeared in Miss Sherlock, a really popular TV series, and another really wonderful horror film that I love called The Inerasable, and was just kind of at the height of her career, and she died very young. And so yeah, so that's now, rewatching these films years later, it's kind of hard not to think about that when I look at them.
Yeah. Oh wow. I completely forgot that was Takeuchi who
Mm.
I remember hearing about the Miss Sherlock actress. I didn't put the two of them together and realize it was the same
Yeah,
one.
yeah. Mm.
Oh wow. Um uh, you mentioned something else too about the debt, and about the debt thing too is also with that there's also this interesting subculture in Japan. I don't know if you heard about this podcast, but Jake Adelstein did this podcast. I think it was like 2 years ago, maybe now. But it was called Evaporated, Gone with the Gods.
Yes, I think I did hear about this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this really interesting idea because he went into all these different stories and reasons why people disappear in Japan, and of course, obviously,
Mm.
some of the big ones he touched on, like the North Korean abductees, but also stuff like women who are leaving abusive households, but people trying to escape debt, and he got interested in this because his accountant ended up being one of these
Yes.
people,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
I remember
so
this.
so yeah, it was a really fascinating thing. So, and I think I had heard that after I'd watched this the first time. So I'm rewatching it again, and they're talking about the stuff with the debt collection and all that.
Mhm.
That kind of stuff was starting to come back to my mind too. And I wonder if that also, so it's one part, the whole cult thing that I was hinting at as well, but also I wonder if another part of it was also this idea of maybe this Honda family, they thought that Mizuta was someone who's going to help them like escape this debt situation they're in or something like that.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think I remember hearing about Jake Edelstein's podcast, and I think there have also been a couple of articles on this subject. Just the fact that, yeah, I think one detail from that podcast and the articles is that in Japan there are moving companies that specialize in moving you in the middle of the night. So if you really need to get away quickly and under cover of darkness, there are moving companies that will move you in at like 3 in the morning or something. So that, it's always interesting to me to see how these industries spring up around certain, so societal issues in Japan. And yes, I think like there is this phenomenon of when certain things happen, like getting into debt, like maybe getting an acrimonious divorce, or even in some cases becoming ill in a certain way or having a mental health breakdown. That one strategy for some people is literally just to disappear and to just pack up your stuff and go somewhere and not tell anyone where you're going. And there's infrastructure in place to help you do that. And for many years, there's an area of Tokyo, near Ueno, that used to be called Sanya. I think it goes by a different name now, but Sanya was historically a place where a lot of day laborers lived. So, people who don't make a lot of money, but they would gather in these sort of construction areas and pick up day jobs. but it also became known as a place for people who wanted to disappear. And so these were people who were in debt. These were people who, had gotten a divorce and who weren't allowed to, live in their homes or be with their children anymore. Sanya was known as a place where you could go and start over, basically, and be anonymous. And so I feel like in this film as well, that phenomenon sort of helps to explain the ludicrousness of what happened here, where it's like, you tell me a whole family of 3 just disappeared and nobody did anything? Like, and it's like, yes, because that does happen. Like, people just kind of vanish, and obviously, their family members or people close to them will look, but at some point they may just stop and say, you know what? I guess they just don't want to be found. And they're able to do that. They're able to go somewhere and not be found, if that's really what they want to do.
Isn't there also a place in Osaka that's kind of similar to that as well?
Yes. I think it's Kasumigasaki, or Kamagasaki, in Osaka. Yeah, Kamagasaki. There's another sort of day labor center in Osaka as well, that where people who just kind of want to disappear for a bit go, and they can also earn a living there because they can get day labor jobs there.
Yeah. Yeah, another thing that was interesting too that I found out through the podcast is sometimes when they leave their families behind, like they'll still send their families money from wherever they're hiding out.
Yes, the sign people in Sanya do that too, for sure.
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that he's playing with here, is just this idea of these societal expectations, like driving people into isolation, and just how that isolation can make them susceptible to predators, basically, in this case.
Yeah.
But also just the whole, it's just such a weird contrast with this very real message he's trying to push, combined with some of the absurdities that happen here, like the whole soundproof dungeon that Nishino has in his house there.
Yeah.
Like I mean, both times I watch this, I'm just like, where is he hiding this thing?
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of defies plausibility. I think this, there's a lot of things that are pretty implausible, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, like with what you're saying about Koichi being kind of that, his creepiness too, because it's at the end of his class and he talks about how he likes talking with students, and we don't actually see him talking with students, we just see him talking
Not
at
really.
students.
Yeah,
so,
we see him lecturing.
So I think it's just that he likes talking about this stuff, and when he's not doing it, then you see how he's really kind of bored, because that's the kind of like the inciting incident that he finds out about this cold case to begin with, is he asks one of his university colleagues, like, what do you do when you're not teaching? It's like,
exactly.
well,
Which
research.
For anyone who's ever worked in a university, is like, you probably know that teaching is maybe 50% of your job in a lot of cases, if you're working like in a full-time position or something. So yeah, to have someone say, what do you do when you're not teaching? It's like, everything else. Like all of my other jobs.
I mean, I'm just an adjunct, but even still, like, I'm just like, don't you have assignments to grade or lessons?
I was gonna say,
yeah, I guess he doesn't. Well, I guess he doesn't do a whole lot of planning, since he's just reading from notes.
Yeah,
there, so.
he just kind of brings his notes and reads aloud. So yeah, he doesn't really seem to have to do much lesson planning or grading, but I mean, I feel like for me at least, it's like meetings. There are lots and lots of meetings.
Oh yeah, one of my friends, he is a full-time professor at the university, and so he often talks about like all the different meetings he has to deal with, and grant writing and all this kind of stuff.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, and as Koichi's colleague says, it's, well, my research, like, that's my other big job, is I have to do my own research, and so so that's what you do when you're not teaching, is you go to meetings, you apply for grants, and you do research.
But then how Koichi just starts horning in on the guy, and he's just like, so what are you doing here? What's this? What's this? What's this? Like, if I was that guy, I was watching this, I'm thinking, I'm like, dude.
It's like, leave me alone. But that's it was also funny to me that they have an open plan office, which, if you're an adjunct in university, then yeah, you probably don't have your own office space. But if you're a full-time or tenured professor, you should have your own office. So it's kind of funny that this guy's just sitting there doing his research in like the faculty lounge or something. But I guess that the plot wouldn't work if they all had their own offices.
All right. Were there any things you wanted to mention about it? I think those are most of the things I wanted to touch on here.
Let me see. Yeah, I think Yeah, I think that this is just a really good example of creating a very creepy mood. And the movie does that really well. And it also um I think I was talking with my students the other day about, just thinking about the way that form shapes content in movies. And this is another great example of that, where just certain editing choices and certain styles of shot just really kind of convey this sort of things are not all right mood. There's one thing that repeats a lot in the film where basically shots will just hold a little bit longer than they should, and after the dialogue is finished, you will sometimes have just the wind will pick up and it'll blow the curtains maybe, or the sort of plastic tarps and things that are near Nishino's house. And it's just kind of the sense that like the wind is blowing in something strange, and or something ghostly is happening, even though there isn't really anything supernatural in this. And another really fascinating scene that I love to watch again and again is both of the sort of interrogation scenes with Saki, the young woman, that happen in the sort of lounge area of the university. If you look through the windows in those scenes, so the lounge has these really big windows where you can see all the students and other people outside. There's a lot of weird stuff happening outside.
Yeah, I
Like,
noticed some of that. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, and I'm sure that, those actors and extras were given instructions as to what to do. And there are just moments where, you're watching this woman being interrogated, but then there's people outside, and they like gather together and they kind of dance around for a second and then they stop. And there are a couple of moments where somebody is sitting outside and you see them through that window, and it feels like they turn and look directly at the camera. And it's just so unnerving if you notice it. And it's just, to me, it's a great example of something that I often see in Kurosawa's films, where interesting things are often happening at the edge of the frame. And so you'll be focused on, what's happening in the center, but then suddenly there'll be just a little bit of movement off to the side, and you'll turn and it's like, whoa, wait, who was that? Like, what did that just happen? So yeah, I really enjoy that aspect of it too.
Yeah, Pulse had some moments like that too, and I think one
Yeah,
of my
yeah, quite a
favorite
few.
shots in Tokyo Sonata, in any
hmm
of his movies actually, was
hmm
when you've got the father, he's arguing with his son, and they're like in the corner, like one side of the frame, and the
Yep.
other side of the frame in the background, you've got the wife is just like
Yes.
beside herself and just like
Yes. Right. Right. Yeah.
and
hmm
and every time you watch this movie, you're like, most people, they're probably just focused on the action there
hmm
of this argument, this very heated argument that's happening. And but when I started watching like the second time, I'm like, wait a second, this is kind of a wide shot here. What's going? And then watching
Yeah.
her and
hmm
focusing on her and the reaction. And
Yeah.
when I taught that movie to my students, I specifically drew attention to that. I'm like, just watch this,
Yeah.
but don't look
Yeah.
over here. Look over here
Right.
and pay
Yeah.
attention to her instead. And it was
Yeah.
a really interesting thing that he does, like that. So where it shows like the action's not where you think it is.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of in the same way that a character like Nishino makes the movie's characters constantly feel unmoored and uncertain. I feel like choices like that make you, the viewer, feel unmoored and uncertain, because you're like, wait, am I supposed to look there? Am I supposed to look there? I'm not sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, and this movie has kind of a schizophrenic views on Letterbox. Like there are some that are like just very, very negative about it, and some that are like
Mhm.
ridiculously positive too.
Yeah.
And I feel like they're both. I feel like neither one is wrong.
Sure.
This,
Yeah. I
because I
think,
feel like
yeah.
they're both approaching it from different ways, and I think like
Mhm.
some people are approaching it from the plot perspective, which yeah is something that drives me nuts about this movie, and others are just approaching it from more of the atmosphere perspective. And I really feel like to really kind of enjoy this movie, you have to kind of just go with the fact that the plot's kind of nonsensical.
Yeah, and I think, I always say it's the mark of a good filmmaker that their films are divisive, and provoke passionate reactions both ways. And I do feel that way about Kurosawa. I deeply love several of his films, and several of them really do not work for me. And my husband and I recently watched Cloud together, and he really enjoyed it, and I did not. And I think, if you were to talk to both of us, about our reasons for either loving or hating it, we'd probably say very similar things. It's like, well, I think I said like, oh, I just felt like it was scattered and all over the place. And I think, but you could also say it's like, oh, but it's just nuts. It just goes in all these different directions. That's really interesting. And with a movie like Creepy, I think quite a few people probably reacted the way that some of my exchange students did, where it's just like, oh, it's just not plausible. It just, and the dialogue feels so stilted and stuff. But then on the flip side, it's like, but it's so weird, and I love that, and it just it gets under your skin, and it's strange. So yeah, I'm quite fickle with these films too, depending on my mood and depending on the day. I might watch it and think that it just really works and it's really great, and then I might be like, no, this is just a mess. It's just a whole bunch of pieces that don't really add up to a whole. But I kind of love that about Kurosawa. I love that I'm never quite sure what I'm gonna get or what I'm gonna come away feeling when I watch his films.
So, with your international students, they obviously had the more negative thing. Your Japanese students, though, I know you mentioned that one student who had that idea. It's like, well, they sound normal to me. But what was kind of their reaction to it? Because when I was talking about this, telling my wife that I was going to be rewatching this for this episode, and I mentioned Creepy, and she's like, "Oh yeah, that was really good." And when I rewatched it last night, I'm like, and I was questioning myself, was it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so some of my Japanese students I think enjoyed it. They thought it was interesting. I think some of them the ones who don't like horror, didn't like it just because it was too intense for them. I think some of them thought it was a little slow. And I often get this complaint when I show Kurosawa's films or just when I show older Japanese horror films at all. Because yeah, if you compare them to the kinds of movies and videos that the students are watching in 2025, they are slow. And they are, they move at just a slower pace, which often I think is lovely. I think it's, I like to take my time with, getting into a creepy atmosphere. But I think for quite a few of the students, it doesn't move fast enough for them.
Yeah, I definitely see that with some of my students when I'm showing them some older movies, and they're so used to the quick cuts, and even sometimes it happens to me too. Like if I'm watching an older movie and I'm just like, oh, this does move really slow.
Yeah, it is different.
And yeah, it's a very different kind of feel, especially for some of the older directors when they were very much coming from like more of a theatrical background. So where it was kind of like, no, you just do these long takes and you just have all the action play out in front of the camera. And for some people they really like that, but other people it's just they need more dynamism in the actual direction as well. Okay, but anyway, Lindsay, this is a fun discussion, and it's good to have you back on again as always. So, anything you'd like to promote? Anything where you'd like to send people?
Yeah, you can find more about me at lindsaynelson.jp. That's LINDSAYNELSON.jp. And you can find me on Instagram and Blue Sky at News from Nihon, NEWSFROMNIHON. And with the Instagram handle, the Blue Sky handle. And if you have access to the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, be on the lookout for an article that I have coming out in a couple of months about fake documentary Q.
So that'll be coming out in a couple of months. You mean around like February, March?
I don't know the exact date yet. It's still in the copy editing process, but sometime in 2026.
Okay.
So probably sometime maybe before June of 2026.
Okay. Well, I think we're actually scheduled for this to come out around the spring for these episodes to start coming out. So
great.
It might already be available then. So go take a look if you have access to that journal. Okay, great. And as for us, japanonfilm.com is the website, japanonfilm.com on Blue Sky, and just Japan on Film on any other socials. And we are part of the Film Stories Podcast Network. So listen up after the credits, hear what else is coming up on. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.